Um, so, all right. All right, so let's start. What I'm going to talk about today is, how you can make your SaaS product more enterprise ready. If your target market is enterprise or Fortune 500 companies, then what should be the features which you should be building for the enterprises to make sure that they can use your product in a more valuable way. Siva has already given a little bit of introduction about me. So I'm Subho Halder, co-founder and CTO at Appknox. And Appknox is into application security, where we kind of help in figuring out security issues in much more optimized way via platform. So now I'll go to the next slide, and I want to keep this a little bit more interactive. If you have joined via phone, you can actually go to Slido, slito.com and join at 428680. And the question which I wanted to ask is, what are the top features which your customers, specifically your enterprise customers, are asking to be built for your product? I'll just wait for like 2-3 minutes for the answers to pop up in the screen. If you have joined via laptop, you can go to this website, and there's a poll section where you can go ahead and type in. So SSO is one such. I can see whitelabeling is another. Many people has entered 42860 itself, but yeah, that's just the joining code. But yeah. And then there is another Q&A section in there. If you have any questions which you want to ask me during the presentation, you can ask there, or you can also use the Zoom's Q&A functionality to ask, right? So I can see a lot of things are coming, like white labeling, plug and play, SOC 2, self-service, user management, role-based access control, yes. And it seems SSO is most requested, as well as access control is another, RBAC is another thing which is most requested. So I'm going to wait for 1 more minute. And yeah. And you can see all of these which are coming in, right? So these are mostly requested feature by your enterprise customers, right? What I'm going to do is I'll just quickly take a screenshot of this so that I can show it later on. All right, so now I'm going to move on to the next slide, because I got an understanding about what are the features which your customers are asking, especially your enterprise customers. And there exists a checklist actually. And the source is enterpriserady.io. You can go to the website, and it actually lists down that these are some of the features which needs to be built, right? And I will be talking about the story at Appknox, how I built it and what are the decisions which I took in to make Appknox more enterprise ready. But these are the basic checklist which needs to be there. I'm just quickly going to go through all of those. So number one is the product offering, which means that you need to have your features in place in a way where it can be gated via paywall, or there is an upgrade available for features which you are building. So the product offering needs to be very strong. Obviously, need a business standpoint also to come up with proper product offering. Role-based access management is another very, very important features which enterprises asks a lot. And this is because enterprises has a lot of employees inside them, and they do not want to give access of everything of your product to everyone. So hence role-based access management is very important for them. Single sign-on is something which is very much asked, and I can see it in the word cloud that that's one of the biggest pain point and for the enterprises, and one of the most asked feature from the enterprises. I'm going to talk more about that. followed by audit logs, which is again very, very important. This is important because enterprises might want to have the activity log of all their users, what they're doing in the platform, and keep a track of those. Product securities and is another very, very important. I saw a lot of word cloud about SOC 2 or ISO compliances, and all of those comes under product security. Change management is how you're going to release customizations as features specific to certain enterprises. I saw a word cloud about customization which came in. So those falls under change management system. Deployment is another thing because now most of the enterprises are moving towards cloud, and hence they are okay to use cloud-based SaaS solution, but there are enterprises which are very heavily regulated, such as bankings or healthcare or BFSI solution. They might require deployments happening in their premise, and how do you address those? And that's something also I'm going to talk about. Team management, integrations, analytics, SLA. Now, these are some other pointers which I'm not going to touch a lot, but I am happy to answer if there are any questions regarding that in the Q&A section. All right. And this is the checklist for engineering team. So all those engineers or developers who have joined, so these are some of the checklists which you need to focus on. I know enterprise-ready.io gives you that checklist, but it's still a little bit vague. And this is the checklist which I have come up while I was developing Appknox, right? And these are some of the decisions which I have to come up with and have a more complete approach towards it. The first one is multi-tenant versus single-tenant. When should you approach multi-tenant, and when should you go for single-tenant? I'm going to talk more about that in the following slides. User management. How do you create your user management in a specific way for enterprise B2B SaaS kind of a company or kind of a product? SSO management. Do you want to go ahead with SSO management via third-party integration, or do you want to build it in-house? Now, that's a debatable question. And how did we come up with what we went ahead with is something which I'm going to also talk about. Deployments, on-premise, hybrid deployment, or even cloud SaaS deployments, how do we handle that? Security assessment and compliance certifications is also something I'm going to talk about. And Whitelabel, I saw a lot of people asking about Whitelabel, which is interesting because this is one such topic which is not present in enterprise-ready.io, but it's being widely asked across all enterprises. Releases and update management. The moment you go for deployment for on-premise and hybrid, you need to also maintain how do you update those deployments and what is your release cadence and things like that. Licensing strategies is something at Appknox we're still working on, but these are the three kinds of licensing strategies which we need to attack. One is offline licensing implementation. For any SaaS product, upwards of ACV, upwards of $100,000, people are not going to attach their credit cards. It will be mostly an offline deal. And how do you manage those kind of licensing implementation? This in itself is a huge topic itself. And I'm not going to attack this problem in this, but I will give you some ideas on how we implemented it. The second is credit card-based licensing. So these are basically SMBs kind of implementation, or even for enterprises where you focus on a smaller team like an HR management tool, where ACV are not more than $10,000. Those kind of clients or those kind of customers tends to go with credit card-based licensing implementation. And then there are credit-based licensing implementation. This is focused more towards SaaS companies who are looking for partnership kind of a growth. How do you manage credits? How do you give partners credits and making sure those credits are utilized, and how do you manage those? So these are three licensing strategies at Appknox, how we use it. Currently, we are still working on this, on how to implement it, but we already have some processes in place to go through these strategies. Followed by audit log management. This is very important for enterprises which are very security focused. Since most of our target market are highly regulated enterprises such as healthcare sector or banking sector or BFSI sector, and they do require audit log management, logs about what their users are doing as a part of their compliances. The next is enterprise integration. Now, please take care about the word enterprise integrations. It's not just integrations. You might start off with a Zapier kind of an integration for your product, but that is not an enterprise level integrations. Enterprise integrations are integrations via your APIs, because you need to also take care that if your product is deployed in an on-premise kind of an environment, how do you take care about the integrations at that point of time and things like that. All those problems comes into the picture. Followed by change management. Obviously, how do you release customization features across your client, and how do you maintain those? So those are change management. I'm not going to touch about change management in this presentation, but these are some things which you also need to keep in mind. And the last part is the SLA and the support management. This is more focused towards engineering and customer support team or customer success team, which you might have in your company. And how do you, bridge that gap between the engineering and the customer success team to make sure that the SLAs are followed and the support is given in a better way. So these are some of the checklists which, as an engineering team, should be taken care of, which is not given at any random place. But this is from my experience about building Appknox more into an enterprise ready kind of a product, right? So the first question is multi-tenant versus single-tenant architecture. And obviously we know the definition of multi-tenant, which means that each individual company or organization will get their each individual instances, and for single tenant, it's the same instance will host multiple companies. Now, the question over here is very important: when and what do you want to go ahead with, right? There are certain examples. For example, Slack or Jira, Atlassian, or others uses multi-tenant kind of a architecture. But if you look at GitHub or other kind of SaaS platform, they actually use a single tenant kind of an application. Now, how did we decide it? And what Appknox uses is single tenant and not multi-tenant. The rationality behind having a single tenant is because the amount of reusability component across all the organization is what makes that decision, right? If your product or if your SaaS product has a lot of user generated content which does not need to be related with other kind of organization, then you should definitely look at multi-tenant as an architecture, right? For example, if you are building a chat based application or a user generated kind of an application, then multi-tenant makes more sense, like marketing applications and things like that. But a single tenant, at Appknox, what we do is we perform assessment, and there are certain kind of checklists which we kind of see. And this checklist remains constant across any or all organizations, right? So not a lot of data changes across organization. Hence, single tenant was much more, simpler and easier for us to go ahead with. And hence we chose single tenant as an architecture to go ahead with. But you can have those kind of a discussion across in your team and figure out what is the best possible way. Now, there are pros and cons also, which I'm just quickly going to touch. For multi-tenant, the pros is obviously security, because each data is divided into others. But the huge con which multi-tenant has is maintenance. And you need to keep a track of all the tenant. Maintenance is a little bit high, specifically if there are breaking changes coming in, making sure how do you propagate those breaking changes across all your tenant. I mean, all of those are already been taken care if you are using some kind of a framework which supports multi-tenant. But still, in case of certain features like SSO and things are affected if you are going ahead with multi-tenant architecture. A single tenant, on the other hand, the pros is it's easy to maintain features and product updates are easier to be pushed across. But there is a con also. A con is a little bit of security because the data is being shared. But obviously there is a logical separation, but you need to take care of that logical separation in a better way. You need to put in your engineering effort in making sure that logical separations are maintained across all the user organization, which means one user should not be able to access data of another user, or from one company, you should not be able to access components of another company. And that requires a little bit of engineering effort. But the maintenance is a breeze for a single tenant kind of an deployment. But whatever tenant you go, it all boils down to two things. One is user management, the other is deployment options, right? And And the and I'm going to talk more about deployment options as well as user management. So the deployment options are like the cloud SaaS and an on-premise deployment. Now, depending on what kind of customers you are dealing with, you can figure out what you need to do. At Appknox, we not only do cloud SaaS, but we not only have a cloud SaaS platform, but we also have an on-premise deployment as a platform. And the reason why you should be going to on-premise kind of a deployment is only if you target highly regulated enterprises, example, BFSI or healthcare, and it requires on-premise deployment, right? The only problem with an on-premise deployment is it is very hard to maintain, update, and deploy. You need to figure out, how to keep them updated. How are the updates being shipped, making sure that, auto updates are enabled and things like that. And a lot of architectural decisions needs to be taken if you are going on an on-premise route. Whereas the cloud SaaS solution is the easiest and widely used deployments across everyone. Enterprises are also moving to cloud and are looking forward to cloud hosted solutions. But it again depends on what kind of enterprises you are focusing more on, right? And that is how you should be focusing more on that. At Appknox, we use both. We have both the cloud hosted platform, which maintains the latest and the greatest versions of Appknox, as well as on-premise deployment, where we actually go ahead and upgrade their versions every quarter or every half yearly, depending on what kind of plans they are in, right? And this is very, very important as far the deployment options are. And the user management model also plays a major role. Now at Appknox, when I started coding about it and architecting, I was a little bit short-sighted, and the way we coded it out was each user will have their own platform and they can invite other user, obviously, but this user will be related to this user, to the existing user somehow. So there is a table of mapping of how users are mapped with the invited users. But the biggest problem over there is how do you manage the usage, the payments, how do you create teams and authentication? So these are some of the pain points which we started facing. And then what we did is we started looking at other SaaS platforms or other SaaS companies, how they have done it. And then we figured out how they have done it is basically creating something called an organization. And this is very much in tune with your business, right? We need to connect as a technology, as an engineering team should connect with the business team, how the business team is onboarding the companies. In our case, we do not onboard users, but we onboard companies, right? So there was a huge disconnect because the engineering team built the product in a way where we were onboarding users, but not a company. But the business team is going ahead and closing deals and onboarding companies. Due to this disconnect, there was a lot of problems which were happening. And it took us around 3 months to refactor the whole thing into an organization-based approach, where whenever the business team onboards a company, we actually create an organization account called the name of the company. It's not a user, but it's an organization, right? And then we attach user to that organization, which makes a lot of things more simpler. And one of the things which makes it simpler is the payments, right? Now, because payment should never be attached to user, payment should always be attached to the company. And the payment can control consumption-based or usage-based or user-based payment, and all of those can be possible if the payment is attached to an organization level rather than a user level payment. So that's something which we solved while we moved from a single user and user inviting other users and having a table of user mapped. Than doing that, we went ahead and created an organization and having all the user mapped to their organization, right? Going forward, the teams as a structure is another something which we had to work on. Since we are using organization itself, so teams are a property of the organization, and the organization can go ahead and create their teams, and the user should be able to create their own teams. That's one of the biggest feature requests which we actually got from most of our clients, right? And the last thing, but not the least, is the authentication and single sign-on, right? Now, single sign-on is unique for each organization, and that is why I'm going to go to the next slide to show you more about that. Now, single sign-on for enterprises in technical terms means SAML and SCIM integration. I'm going to discuss more about that later. But these are not Facebook logins or social logins, right? This is not Twitter-based login. What single sign-on in enterprise perspective means is a SAML-based sign-on, right? A point to note, Google G Suite also supports SAML-based sign-on, right? So what is a SAML-based sign-on? SAML-based sign-on is basically a protocol via which a user can be authenticated. And why is it very important? Single sign-on is important for enterprises because enterprises has huge amount of people working there, and they need to have a control over who all have access to all of these SaaS products. So single sign-on becomes a very important problem for them. And single sign-on actually solves that problem, right? So they do not need to onboard their user management team into the SaaS platform. Their user management team, each enterprises has their own user management team, and enterprises uses things like ADFS, which is like Active Directory or others, right? And these user management team of these enterprises can give access to your product or can revoke access easily. So whenever a team from the enterprise leaves or gets offboarded, it's easier for their team to revoke access to the platform. And that is very much possible using single sign-on. Now the problem is, how do we develop this, right? This is a very important thing. And we decided there are two ways of approaching single sign-on in terms of development. One is a third-party managed SSO, where services such as Okta, OneLogin, Auth0, they provided out-of-the-box support for single sign-on, right? The pros is it's very easy to maintain and integrate these services without much development effort. Right? You can actually, when we were defining this stage, it took us around less than a week to integrate with Auth0 and come up with it, right? But there are problems. It cannot be used in a on-premise or a hybrid kind of a deployment, right? Because this deployment requires whitelisting of these third-party services if you're using, and then there are security implications also, because now your enterprise, for the deal to close, for your enterprise deals to close, they will not only ask compliance report or security audit report of your product, but they will go ahead and even ask for all the third-party integrators which you're using, their compliance reports and things like that. And the third, which is very important con, is you are basically handing off your authentication mechanism to a third party and you're trusting them to take care of that rather than you maintaining the overall thing, right? So even though it is easy, it's very easy as an MVP to go ahead and work on third-party managed SSO. But then at Appknox, we actually went out and developed an in-house single sign-on, right? And the reason why we did it is because we can customize the solution and it is very, very flexible to implement it. And if you are in multi-tenant kind of an application model, you actually need to put a kind of a hackish way to implement single sign-on over Okta or OneLogin. Auth0 provides that by default. But and for us, for single tenant kind of a application, we have organization, and we actually connected SSO with the organization object itself, which means that each and every organization, which means each and every company, will have their own single sign-on in a cloud SaaS platform, as well as we can also extend that for the on-premise or hybrid deployments, which we have, right? And the thing is, since there is no third-party dependency, they do not need to whitelist IPs or whitelist or put their whitelist in their firewall to have an access to Okta or Auth0. And it is very, very much easier to, for them to integrate it. It also satisfies security and compliances, which you might have, and you do not need separate third-party integrator compliances for that, right? Although the biggest con to develop an in-house SSO is it takes a lot more development and maintenance time. It took us around 2.5 months to come up with a SSO. We came up with an MVP where we came up with an SSO which kind of gives you access to the whole product, because the first implementation of SSO which we had to do was an on-premise kind of an implementation. So it didn't matter. But then going forward, soon enterprises which are using our cloud SaaS platform also started requesting for a similar feature. And then we had to rework on the overall SSO and the overall effort to come up with an in-house SSO took us almost around 2.5 months to do it. Also, it took a little bit more time because we need to understand how SSO works, what is SAML, what is SCIM, how does the integration work, and to architect it in a better way. That took us a lot more time than the implementation part. The implementation is pretty easy, but to come up with an architecture for that took a lot of time, right? Going forward to the next part is obviously.
Subho, there are a few questions in the Q&A section. Maybe you want to take those. Just maybe read out the question and
Sure. So one of the question, I think the definition of single tenant, multi-tenant was interchanged in the PPT. Is that correct? Let me just go through. Probably hosted and yeah. I'm so sorry. I mean, I created the PPT in the morning itself, so probably there was some, yes, obviously. So multi-tenant is where each organization will have their, it's like multiple organization will have a single tenant, and single tenant is each organization will have their own single tenant. I'm so sorry for the misconfiguration over here. But yeah, point noted. Thank you so much, Vivek. Yeah, so this is done. Probably I'm going to fix this after the presentation. User management along with RBAC should be fairly solved problem. By now, are there any off-the-shelf OSS framework? So yes, user management along with RBAC is a solved problem. But I have seen, since we are working with a lot of enterprises as well as startups in terms of in terms of giving security and figuring out what are the security issues they come up, there are still a lot of companies, SMBs, who are targeting enterprises. Actually, it's not solved for them. Obviously, one can go ahead and use services like Auth0 or Okta to do it, but the architecture still remains, in that way. There's another question by Raghu. User management model, if there is a service changes in the payment done by user, how this is going to be handled in SaaS model? Very interesting question, actually. So since payments are attached to organization, the way we did it is we can attach multiple payment models in the organization, right? So for example, if and we have two kind of offering at Appknox. One kind of offering is per app kind of a license, and the other is per scan kind of a license, right? And a company and an organization actually can go ahead and purchase both, right? The way we handle it is in the organization level itself. And what we do is, in terms of SaaS, there is a concept called projects. And these projects are again linked to organization. And you can define whether this project follows what kind of license. And that's how we maintain it. So for example, project A might fall under license model A and project B might fall under license model B. This is another problem. The complexity increases because the way we handle our user management. But if each companies has their own kind of a, like if you look at Atlassian, how they do it is they do not allow multiple licensing model to be attached to a single instance. You can create another instance of the same company and you can attach licensing model over there. But in our case, we actually allow multiple licensing models to be attached to the same organization. I hope that kind of answers. In the hindsight, was it a good idea to implement SSO yourself? Yes, I would say it was a good idea because multiple enterprises actually uses our SSO for user management, and this is a very, very important aspect for enterprises. Now, whenever there is an RFP which comes in, right, that's request for proposal, whenever the enterprises goes ahead and wants to acquire a SaaS product, one of the questions which they have in those sheets are you using any third-party integration? And the moment I fill out no, there is no such extra process required. The time to live for these enterprises are much shorter if you have those custom built. Obviously, there is a trade-off and which you need to figure it out, right? the trade-off which we did on the hindsight, we actually did it in a better way where we came up with an MVP kind of an SSO implementation where we actually went ahead with Okta. And then we went ahead and built our own integration after understanding the user problem in a better way, right? On the hindsight, yes, I think we did it in a better way, although it took a little bit of time. But yeah, I think that was a better way of going forward. So yes, there are SSO implementations, open source SSO implementation available. You can actually, there is key cloak, I guess. So there are certain SSO implementation which are available, which you can go ahead and check. There are SDKs also available, which makes your life a lot easier. You don't have to do it from the scratch. Currently at Appknox, we actually use OneLogin's SDK. It's a Python SDK to perform all of this. Obviously, the logic is on top of us. But we use that SDK for the SAML communication. For Node.js, there is Passport SAML, which you can go ahead and use. For Python, we use OneLogin SDK, so which you can go and use use that. So yeah. All right. I will just go. Okay. If there are any other single sign-on based questions, you can also ask it in the Q&A. After each slides, I'll actually review the Q&A once again. So I think that will be helpful. Right. So I'll move on to the next one. The Whitelabel, right? So now this is very interesting. You won't find Whitelabel as a feature in enterprise-ready.io, but this is one of the most asked feature requests for enterprises. Now there are different kinds of Whitelabel which you can do, right? And it depends on what kind of product you have, right? Now let's say if yours is a chat kind of a product where the enterprise's end customer actually views the product, right? For example, if it is a chat-based or a support system product which happens, right? Whitelabel in that case might be, for example, you might have powered by your company name. In our case, powered by Appknox, right? So you can actually go ahead and have a plan where you can remove that branding itself altogether, right? That's also called a Whitelabel kind of a thing. The other kind of a Whitelabel is obviously customizing your dashboard to match the enterprise brand, right? Customizing themes, colors, and things like that. The other kind of Whitelabel is also adding custom logo on top of it. So this might be also a self-service portal, let's say, like Zendesk Help Desk, right? Or Fresh Chat Help Desk in that case, right? So they do have options to Whitelabel the overall help desk to match your branding color. And this is a very, very important feature if you're actually targeting enterprise customers, right? There's another use case also for which we had to work on Whitelabel, and that is partners, right? At Appknox, most of our revenue also comes via partners, and partners also wants to deploy the same solution with a different name, and we are okay with that, right? And Whitelabel also helps our product to have a greater and a better reach in different platforms in different regions. For example, Appknox is also known as AppSecure in the Middle East, right? It is also known as something else in US. And these are all Whitelabel instances of Appknox itself, right? Sold by our partners. And that's how it works, right? Obviously, you can charge a lot on top of Whitelabel, but these are three kinds of Whitelabeling options which you might have. Depends on what kind of product and what kind of offerings you have. To remove the branding of the product itself is one way of Whitelabeling it. Customizing themes or the color options is another kind of Whitelabeling, and also to add custom logo and branding on top of your product is also the third level of Whitelabel, right? And Appknox, we actually do all the three. Our front end is actually open source, and enterprises can actually go ahead and tweak the front end itself in their own way, adding logo, creating themes, and deploying it there. And obviously, the backend is still hosted by us, and they still need an account and a licensing to access that. So Whitelabel is pretty important for a SaaS kind of a product which is targeting enterprises, right? And then I'm going to talk about security and compliance. This is very, very, very important. I know in the word rap bubble, a lot of bubble came up with SOC 2 implementation and others. So while selling to enterprise, regular security audits and compliance certifications are very much necessary. It is even necessary to even bid for RFPs. We are a security company. for us, we need to hire third-party security, even not sometimes a competing security companies to come and audit us, right? So that's very much required for us. And it is very, very important, right? So these are the following details which we need to get from in terms of security and compliances. Get your company certified with ISO or SOC 2 certification. This is very much important. If you're not certified, you can still bid for these projects, but you need to actually fill up security. There is a separate sheet for compliance for enterprise RFPs, which you need to fill it up in a separate way. But if you already have certification in place, you might as well have all the policies in place, and it becomes much more easier to onboard these enterprises. The sales cycle goes a way lot down if you have security and compliances altogether, right? And for heavily regulated enterprise such as banking or healthcare sector itself, security is something which is a mandate over there, right? For banking sector, RBI mandates that it needs to have security for all the SaaS products, or any product for that matter, needs to have those security certification. Now, as a part of the certification itself comes that you need to have security audit happening every quarterly or half yearly, right? I would obviously suggest to go ahead with quarterly, but for example, if you're going with ISO, you can actually define your policy to have a half yearly audit, but quarterly audit is very, very important. And just understand that these audits are very, very important for your organization too, because there are security gaps which comes in, and it is very important for your engineering team to address these security gaps which comes in. Just make sure that your engineering teams get these security issues which comes in to be fixed in a prompt way, in a actual way, to find out the root cause and fix the root cause, right? These audits should not be done just to get a green card. I mean, obviously, at the end, you are going to get a green card, but this actually helps your company to be more compliant and resilient towards security. Make sure that is done. Data privacy, depending on the geographies you are targeting. If you're targeting enterprises based out of Europe, obviously GDPR is something which needs to be taken care of. CCPA is compliance related to California, US. If you're targeting companies based out of California, enterprises based out of US, CCPA is another such compliance which is very, very important. And this is something which we are seeing are widely asked feature set from the enterprises, right? So just make sure that your data privacy are in order. And just to give you an example, these data privacy are self-assessed data privacy. So you do not need to actually get a certification done for GDPR. You can self-assess yourself. You can use the security audit to make sure that your company's data policies are all taken care of, and you can self-assess all of this. You need to obviously assign a data protection officer, but more of this GDPR thing, you can actually go to gdpr.com as the website, and they have defined a lot of things on top of that, right? You need to also have a very defined privacy policy. I don't know how many of you actually have a properly defined privacy policy. Most of the companies with whom we have worked with, I've seen their privacy policy is basically a ripoff or a copy paste from another privacy policy, which is okay to start off with, right? But you should actually have a well-defined privacy. It takes you a maximum a week to come up with a proper, well-defined privacy policy, but please do work on it, right? And this is also something which is asked by enterprises. Mostly these are all reactive things which we do. Whenever the companies ask for a privacy policy, we immediately go to another company, probably Freshchat or Freshdesk, copy paste a privacy policy. But it's not good to do that way, because their company privacy policy will differ in a lot of ways than your company's privacy policy. Define your own privacy policy, take examples from these companies, and then define it. And then the last, which is very, very important, is the security incident policies, right? The moment you are targeting enterprises and your name is coming up in media, there would be hackers who would try to, breach your system or try to get data out of his system. And if they do find it, they will go ahead and mail you and ask you bounties and things like that. So make sure that you have a security incident policy internally in your company. At Appknox, we have this. Since we are a security company itself, we regularly get attacked with a lot of attackers, because they want to take us down, or they just want to be famous that, okay, we kind of figured out an issue on a security company itself, and that kind of affects our reputation also. So we had to take all of this very, very seriously. But security incident policy is something which is very, very important for companies which are targeting enterprises specifically, right? And in terms of product, a product should have also the following things. It should support multi-factor authentication. I don't know how many enterprises have asked, but if single sign-on is not something which they go ahead and use, then the other alternative thing which they might ask you is, do you have multi-factor authentication? At Appknox, we have both SSO as well as multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication in our case is a TOTP-based authentication. TOTP-based is time-based OTP authentication, which is like basically your Google Authenticator or Authy-based authenticator. But not all enterprises uses that, right? So then we came up with other kind of an authentication, which is email-based authentication also, right? So these are certain common multi-factor authentication which you can actually create for your product, and which is very, very important, gives you a bonus point that you take security seriously. And the last point in that is the viewable or a downloadable audit logs. For us, we just have a downloadable audit logs at Appknox. That's what we created. We didn't have time to create a viewable, and we didn't go ahead and created that. Although enterprise-ready.io actually tells you that you should have a viewable audit log along with sort and sort features. And what is an audit log basically? An audit log is basically the log of all the user action which happened in that organization, which includes when a user has logged in, when the user has logged out, any actions they have taken, if they have uploaded an app or created a new project, deleted a project, created a new integration, and all of these activity logs are basically the audit logs. And this is very, very important for enterprises. If the downloadable audit logs are not available via your dashboard, the enterprises are going to mail you to get those audit logs from your database and send it to them in CSV format and things like that. So we initially started with that, and then we moved on to a dashboard-based downloadable audit logs going forward. So currently we are at that phase, right? Now, moving on is the release and the update management. This is so very important. I'll just quickly check Q&A if there is no such Q&A as of now. But okay, so release and update management is something which is very, very important for product companies who are targeting enterprises, because there should be a user-facing changelog, which is very important for enterprises, because enterprises are paying you in terms of subscription-based licensing model. So they want to know, why do they want to keep the subscription alive? What is the new features of value you're bringing out? And so a user-facing changelog is very, very important. This is something which we're actually working on. And in the next couple of months, we are actually going to come up with a user-facing changelog. Currently, we don't have, but this is something which has been asked a lot from our current enterprises. Product update emailers, obviously, this is something which we currently do it, but slowly we're going to phase this out once we have a user-facing changelog which comes out. For on-premise deployment product, one should keep in mind the update or patch deployment timeline. So once we deploy it in an on-premise kind of an environment, we keep forgetting, when we deploy it, and when do we have to go ahead and update it. Because a cloud SaaS platform always is at the greatest and the latest. If you have initially we used to deploy every week. Now we have reduced that with a planned deployment process, but it is not possible for you to push out updates every week to your on-premise deployment, right? So we need to have a proper release management. We know that whenever there is a major change which is happening, architectural change which is happening, we need to go ahead and deploy. We need to also keep a track of all the on-premise deployments which we have done. And in every quarter, we have to go and deploy any bug fixes which has come out. And we also need to keep in mind all the customization also which has been done for each and every kind of a deployment, right? And for that, we also need to take care of consumption and user-based licensing strategies while the release and the update management is happening. Because, for example, if I do an on-premise deployment and the company came for our annual engagement, so we need to keep in mind that the engagement gets over at what day, and we should be able to have at least one deployment happening nearing the date of completion of their deployment, right? So that we can go ahead and upgrade or or renew the license once again. So we need to also keep those license management really tied to the release management or the update management, right? So these are some of the problems which we faced, and we try to address these problems. But yeah, so yeah, at Appknox, we are still working on the release management, user-facing change logs, but we also have in place the license management, and keeping a track of all deployed instances is also something which is in the works. We currently track it in a separate way, but we are actually working on figuring out how to keep a track of all of those, right? So before moving, there are questions: how to take care of database changes in cloud and on-premise management? Any standard process to manage this? Yes. So database changes in cloud and on-premise, this actually had a lot of problem with us. In the cloud, it's very easy because we also write our migration scripts on how the database is going to get migrated, which is easy. But in case of an on-premise, since you do a quarterly deployment, there might be a lot of changes which might happen in the database, and your migration script may be out of sync, or you need to make sure that the migration scripts are placed in a way where you migrate one by one in a processed manner, in a phased manner. So that's something which we keep a check on. Since we use Django, Django Python, Django framework automatically takes care of database migrations in a better way. And we have migration scripts also, which we write if there are things which needs to be added or changed in a separate way, right? So yeah, most of the time the cloud deployed versions are always ahead. It's always at the latest and the greatest, but the on-premise version is always a quarter behind. Uh, and that's something which we have to keep in mind. Customization also introduces a lot of database changes, but we made sure that we are not going to do customization which actually requires model changes or database changes, or we should not do anything which actually requires a lot of architecture. So we say no to those kind of customization unless it's very simple, or if there are customization which is coming in, we try to actually go ahead and display those customization or implement those customization across all the companies or everyone. So yeah, so that's one. Sandeep had a question about any specific best practices you have learned for managing multiple versions of the product and customizations. Very, very interesting question, Sandeep. Yes, I have a lot of learning, but I'm still figuring out how to maintain it. Initially, obviously, as everyone does it, we used to manage it in an Excel sheet, and then we shifted to Trello boards, and now we are actually trying to shift it to Jira, kind of a process management. But it is very, very imperative and very important on managing multiple versions of products, as well as keeping in tune of the customization, which we also do. Currently, this is how we do manage it. We only have around 6 or 7 on-premise deployments, so it is very easy for us to manage these. But the moment the number of deployments actually increases more than 20, that is the time it becomes more, and then probably I have to come up with a better process. But all of these are processes. You do not need a tool to do it, but you need to have a very robust process to do it, right? I'm so sorry for the notifications. Okay, so this is done. Okay, so now these are certain resources which is there from where I created the presentations, and some user-generated blog contents which you can actually go ahead, and obviously I'm going to share this PPT in the SAAS Boomi channel. Feel free to share it among your team. I'm going to obviously fix the mistake which was there in the first slide. So I will be open for question. I can see obviously there's one question which is there, where Auth0 or managed SSO would fail in terms of compliance or security. It will not fail per se, but for example, Auth0 has SOC 2 implementation. I mean, they have a SOC 2 certification as well as ISO 2007 certification, which is good. But let's say you do not have a SOC 2 certifications as of now, right? Now, it will be pretty weird to fill up the RFP itself saying that, our authentication is managed by Auth0, which has all of the certification, but my product doesn't have, right? So all of those discrepancies comes up, which kind of delays the overall process. And the second thing is you are actually putting the authentication flow to a third party, especially for us as a security company. That was a no-no for the enterprises. They want everything to be maintained by us itself, and that was one of the biggest problem which we face. But again, it depends on companies to companies, and it also depends on how you go ahead and deploy it. And for us also, another thing is our on-premise deployment cannot support Auth0 or managed SSO service. We need to create our own managed SSO service, and that was one of the biggest reason why we had to move away from managed SSO service. Yes, we did implement it, but we had to actually move away. So yeah, so that was another question, I guess. Let me see. There are some questions in the chat itself. We use Headway app. We are trying to adopt conventional commits to generate changelog from commits. Yes, but please do not do that. I'll tell you why. Because your user-facing, customer-facing features are completely different than your back-end facing features. Specifically, if your product is, because try to maintain a customer-facing changelog in a different way than the engineering-facing changelog, because it's not helpful for engineers. If there is a bug which has happened for commit-based changelogs, if there is a bug which happened, and if the customer goes and says, there is a bug happening over here, because you're going to try to make your commit messages more in terms of customer facing messages, which has a problem in itself. So try to have, unless your product is an engineering specific product, unless you are building an SDK itself, or you are building something where the developers are the intended audience, right? If that is the case, then it's okay. But if you, because we try to go ahead with that, but we have to do it. The other thing is, do you folks use any third-party products for release updates? We use Confluence. You can use Notion. It's just documentation, right? You just have a proper process of documentation. That's all, right? We use Confluence because we use also Jira for product management, and we can actually map all of this from Jira to Confluence in a better way, in an automated way. So yeah. Okay, someone did a self-promotion. Yeah. Yes, I think there are, again, Q&A. There are two. Vivek, to touch upon analytics, any pattern to provide self-serve analytics in multi-tenant environment? So this is something which we are still figuring out, Vivek. Very good question. What we figured out is analytics depends from product to product. You need to do a lot of customer interviews to figure out what are the analytics which they would require. We actually came up with an analytics dashboard from our own hypothesis, and we saw like 90% of the people never even clicked on the analytics dashboard, right, to figure out what are the analytics. And the reason is we didn't do a lot more customer interviews, which we are doing right now. And that's one of the problems which we are trying to fix it as of now. So, so to touch upon the analytics, any pattern which you want to display, please talk to your customer, understand what they do. And what we are doing currently is our customer success team is actually creating that analytics in the email and sending it in a manual way. And once that gets validated enough, we're going to actually implement that into a product. Just make sure that you follow that. And that's how you should be building your analytics in your product, right? What kind of automated testing do you use for your front-end and back-end code bases, Jatin? So thank you, Jatin, for the question. So basically, our developers write their unit test and the integration test, and we use code for code coverage. But if you're talking about UI testing or API testing, we do not have a QA team, and that is very bad. I accept it. So there's a company called Cloud QA, and there are multiple companies in SaaS Boomi whom you can contact. So they can give you much more better idea. There are Selenium ways of actually performing UI or regression kind of a testing, which we actually don't do. And that's something very bad from our side. And that's something which we are actually fixing it. But in terms of code basis, yes, we write test cases. We have actually 90+% coverage about our code bases. And it is very, very important and imperative for your developers to write tests before the PRs gets merged. We actually have a failure case scenario if you're changing anything, and if that patch change doesn't have a code coverage, we actually do not merge it during our code review. So yeah, it's very, very important in terms of code base testing. Any experience with multiple instances of HA deployments on-prem? Do you use Kubernetes? Oh, okay, this is a very, very important question. We are actually hosted on top of Kubernetes, our cloud SaaS offering. Unfortunately, we do not use Kubernetes in the on-premise. We actually use Docker Compose in our on-premise. The reason is twofold, right? One is Kubernetes is an overkill to be deployed. Kubernetes is an overkill to be deployed in an on-premise kind of a setup. But there are certain flavor of Kubernetes which has come up, like K3s. I was actually discussing about that with other engineers also about K3s. And there are some other flavors of Kubernetes which has come up, which you can actually, of course, go ahead and experiment. But what we do is the simplest way is using Docker Compose to deploy it in on-premise. And yeah, and the high availability is something which for on-premise enterprises do not care about high availability. The reason why they want to go with an on-premise is for security reasons. If the high availability is something which is required, it is basically in terms of cloud-based. I mean, they are okay to go in cloud-based if high availability is something which is required. But we haven't seen a lot more problems in that. So I hope it kind of answered your question. What's your view on an open source such as Keycloak? Yeah, Keycloak. So the problem with Keycloak is, again, one thing is if you want to implement Keycloak, it's basically an identity management solution. It's again a little bit of overkill. I mean, it's easier to integrate Okta and Auth0 than to integrate Keycloak. And it is also written in Java, if I'm not wrong, and you need to maintain that. A lot of maintenance problem which actually happened. We actually tried to use Keycloak, but then we figured out it was much, much easier to actually write our own. But it again depends on your technical team or your decisions or your architectural thing. But you should try to actually come up with a MVP kind of a solution for your SSO and then slowly build on top of that. So that's something which I would obviously recommend. Have you explored third-party system integrators for deploying your application? Yes, we did. We actually did. But what we realized is we actually need a better documentation for third-party integrators. And it needs to be an exhaustive documentation. It cannot be just documentation, right? So we have partners who actually goes ahead and tries to deploy our solution, but currently we also stay on the call. But for the on-premise deployment, third-party system integrators would require a lot more training, as well as a lot exhaustive documentation about how to deploy and troubleshooting and all of those. Those are very, very important in terms of third-party system integrators, right? So I think that kind of answered your questions. Are you guys using any kind of microservice architecture? Oh, this is very interesting question. So we started the code of, so again, this is an architectural question actually. It depends on what kind of product you are building, right? Our current Appknox product is a monolith, but say it so, the code is divided into a lot of, small libraries, which we import together into a single repo, and then we actually deploy the single repo together. And it is a monolith. The reason why we went ahead with monolith architecture is because it felt it was easier for us to do the deployments. And we actually wrote this code way down the line, like 6 years ago, right? That's when we architected this code. But we are actually coming up with a new product, and that is completely being built on top of microservice architecture. And the thing with microservice architecture is you need to keep in mind, if you are also going to offer an on-premise kind of a deployment, you need to make sure that this microservice architecture itself works in an independent way, which means that in an on-premise deployment, you need not deploy all the microservices, but you can actually deploy whatever the microservices which are required for the deployment. And that is something a very well architecture guy will actually think in terms of microservices if you're actually going ahead in an on-premise path also, right? Just make sure that you keep that in mind. There is another question. What logical separation would you recommend for multi-tenant setup? Does every table have a hook to organization to? Yes, correct. That's the basic one. We have a relationship with the organization table itself to ensure the logical separation is done, and everything else, the data is shared. For us, it makes more sense because not much user-generated content is made. It is mostly system contents. So basically the security issue which we discover from the application is just pasted, and that's fine, right? And all the test cases are common across all the organization. The moment you shift into user generated content or content which requires like a lot of content heavy SaaS product or application like resume parsers or HR based, it is much more easier for you to actually have a separate tables for each organization. I mean, separate instances actually itself for each organization. So yeah, I think that kind of answered your question. But for us, it was much more simpler. And the logical separation is based on a hook to the organization. It's a one-to-one kind of a mapping to organization. So yeah. All right. I think I have answered most of the question, and I think the presentation was useful. I know that we are already past the time, and I had a hard stop. But yeah, if you have any question, feel free to ping in the SaaS Boomi channel, or you can drop me a mail or connect me over Twitter. I'll obviously be sharing the slides in the SaaS Boomi channel after the talk. And if you have any questions, anything, happy to answer. I've been helping people in terms of SSO for the past few years because that's one of the biggest feature requests I know, which is being asked across all the thing. But yeah, but I'm happy to share my experiences, the little experiences which I have while developing Appknox. So thank you so much. I would stop sharing my screen in that case. Yeah.
Thanks, Subho. Yeah, and thanks everybody for attending. Hope this was fun. Do send some notes on what we can do better next time, and we'll have additional talks coming up as well. But yeah, I hope you've learned, taken some learnings that you can apply in your own companies, in your own products. Thanks again, Subho, for a wonderful presentation. And we'll figure out how to sort of share this. Once I sort of talk to Subho, and we'll figure out how to share this with the wider audience.
Sure. Absolutely.
All right. Thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye. Take care. Stay safe.